Okay, wonderful. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my PowerPoint slide. Um, and for those of you who are joining me for the first time, and I think I'm only got one or two new students here. Tabitha, I think you're one of them. But if you are joining me for the first time, so I I'm happy to take questions throughout the session. You can just direct your questions directly to me. So I've now disabled the everyone comment. So you can just send me a comment directly or send a comment directly to myself, and I will answer those questions as we go along. I try to go at a steady pace. I know some of you in the last session said that we were going too fast, but also some of you said we were going too slow. So I've tried to, go at a steady pace. But for some of you, especially if the topics are new to you, you may need to go back and listen and watch the video again if you feel you've missed something, right? So do excuse me if I do go a bit too fast, but we do have a number of essays to get through. I mean, extraordinarily, we went through around 12 essays in our first 4 sessions. And I think that's pretty good going. I can't remember doing that in previous years. So we have gone through quite a lot of essays so far. So until now, we've done political parties and we have done electoral systems. I normally spend 2 lessons per topic, right? So we've got to go, we've got democracy to go, and we've got voting behavior in the media to finish. So I plan to do those over these next 4 weeks. And then in early March, we will start component 2. So that should give us March and a little bit of April to complete component 2. So I think we're on track. I think we're doing well. And I hope that by the end of this, you'll be prepared. Okay, here we go. I got another person asking me for a password. So they obviously didn't get the email. I'm going to send it to them now. Right. Okay. Sia, I was just wondering, will we be sent a link with these PowerPoints and videos on, like how, yeah, you've got it's on the original, on that doc. In fact, can you confirm it is on the doc? But you would have a separate page with a password that would have the videos and the slide on them. I hope I haven't omitted it from the document, but I'm sure I did put on the, oh, okay. All right, Sia, you didn't receive the original thing. I will send it to you. Just remind me if I forget. I will send it to you on email. But yeah, no worries. Okay. Right. Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes for people to join us. Let's just hope everyone is here. Yeah. Okay. We've got a fair number, and we are slowly growing in number. Okay. So let's start by talking about the specification for democracy. So we're going to look at democracy today. Now, democracy is, of course, one of the first topics you guys look at. And there are 4 subtopics within democracy. You've got basically direct and representative democracy. So that's the one big thing you need to know. What's the difference between direct and representative democracy, and what are examples of the failings and the positives of both types of democracy? You've got this wider franchise and debates about the suffrage point, which, by the way, you would never get a question on. So it's a historical look at democracy, but it doesn't really register. You wouldn't need to think about it when it comes to the exam, to be honest. You may want to use it as an occasional example, but you can almost cross that off as a thing to revise. You've got pressure groups and other influences. So here's where you've got pressure groups and think tanks and corporations and lobbyists. And if you remember back to the 2019 exam, there was a question about lobbyists and pressure groups and think tanks, but also there was a question last year about pressure groups, which I'll give you and I'll show you in a second. And then you've got this rights in context section. In fact, the question last year was on rights. The question the year before was again on pressure groups. And within that rights discussion, you've got how valuable, how how much rights are protected in the UK, and how much are liberties, undermined by the government in the UK, or safeguarded by pressure groups and others. And there has been a question. In fact, there have been a couple of questions again on rights previously, and I'll show you those questions in a second, right? So if you ask me, where have they not yet had any question? Which one of these subtopics have we yet not had a question in the last 4 exams? It's basically topic 1. We haven't had a direct democracy or a representative democracy question. So the types of questions in topic 1 would be, would direct democracy would improve representative democracy? Or you could get a question in there, to what extent is representative democracy failing in the UK? Or is there a democratic deficit in the UK, right? Those sorts of questions could come up as part of 1.1. So we are going to focus a little bit on that. But of course, we can't neglect these 2, because possibly you could get a rights question or a pressure groups question. Right, just a quick glance at the last few papers. So we've had a question here on think tanks, lobbyists, and pressure groups, as I said, in 2019. There was a question here, evaluate the view that the actions of pressure groups have been more significant than government legislation in defending and promoting rights in the UK, right? So again, it's about pressure groups, but it's about rights. And I found students found this question particularly difficult because they didn't have enough pressure groups that were focused on rights. So like Liberty or the Howard League of Penal Reform, these are rights pressure groups. And often we learn about environmental pressure groups, for example, but they're not specifically rights groups. And this question really was asking about rights groups versus government legislation in defending rights. Okay, so you've got a question. If you go back there, we've got one question that comes from here. We've got one question that comes from here, right? Use it as a source question. Evaluate the view that in a democracy, MPs are free to ignore referendum results and their own political party manifestos. It's sort of a democracy question, but there is a link to political parties. So what they decided to do here is they had a blend of parties and democracy. So it was still a democracy question, but there was political parties involved in that question as well. So it was a little tricky. Then lastly, you had evaluate the view that neither individual rights nor collective rights in the UK are adequately protected and guaranteed. So it was a very clear question about rights. Now, I felt that a number of students didn't get the difference between collective and individual rights. I mean, last year I got this feeling that it may come up. So we did a lot of work in these sessions. In fact, I did a lot of work with my students on individual and collective rights. And it paid dividends because the students came out of the exam pretty happy that they had learned the difference between the 2 types of rights. But when we look at rights, we will talk about what the difference is between collective rights and individual rights. Okay, but these are the questions that have already come up. I've listed some questions that we could possibly look at as we go along. So I'm not going to read through these, but these are questions you can revise from. If we don't get through in all of these, my advice is to revise from these questions primarily. Lena, was paper 1 the tricky exam you were talking about? Well, I don't know if it was tricky. I mean, some students found it very difficult. I think partly because of the way some of these questions were worded. I must say that my students who sat through the exam didn't actually find it that difficult. I know across the country, there were lots of complaints about paper 1 and the wording of the questions. In particular, they didn't like this. There was another question you may have seen on pick and mix in relation to political parties. And there was a lot of, there were a good number of complaints about those questions. I mean, the emails I got, at least after the exam, was, it was really positive. So I was quite surprised when I found that a number of teachers had been pretty unhappy about that exam. Okay. So we're going to start with the following question. And the question is, evaluate the view that the wider introduction of direct democracy will improve the quality of the UK's representative democracy. God, I've run out of breath already. Right. So the wider introduction of direct democracy will improve the quality of UK's representative democracy. That's one question. And then there's a similar question, which I've labeled as question 13. Evaluate the view that apart from referendums, the introduction of other forms of direct democracy would undermine representative democracy in the UK. Right. For those of you who are now having a panic attack, what is the problem or the potential problem with this question as opposed to that question there? Like, what would you not do? What's the challenge here? Yeah. What's the challenge here? While I sip my, okay, what is this tea? This is lemon and ginger tea. Lemon and ginger tea, right? So yes, Izzy, you can't talk about referendums in the second one. Fantastic, right? The second one doesn't permit you to talk about referendums. Whereas I suppose you can talk about referendums here. Now, very theoretically, at least, I would say this is a question that more likely would come up as a democracy question. Why? Because if you remember, we tackled referendums under electoral systems. They have put electoral referendums under that topic, under electoral systems. And so I would say if they were to ask you a democracy question like this, they probably would tell you not to talk about referendums and then to talk about other forms of direct democracy. And here's the problem. I think not enough students know about other forms of direct democracy. And so what you'll end up doing is you'll end up just talking about the general pros and cons of direct democracy. Direct democracy leads to the tyranny of the majority. It leads to mob rule. It leads to, people becoming disenchanted because they participated and then their view was not taken. So all of those negative aspects of direct democracy are true, but you've got to be able to example some forms of direct democracy beyond referendums, right? And I'm going to go through some forms of direct democracy today. Right. So here's an introduction. Direct democracy is a form of democracy that allows citizens to make decisions on policy without representatives. There are various forms of direct democracy: recall elections, citizens' juries, town hall meetings, e-petitions, and initiatives, right? So I've just listed the different types of direct democracy. It would be argued that direct democracy fails to achieve its intended aims of greater participation, the settling of disputes, and can harm minority rights. Introducing more forms of direct democracy will harm the UK's representative democracy, right? So that's my judgment. Okay, it's a little bit, so we're answering both questions, Grace. We're basically answering, I mean, these are very similar questions, except this one will enable you to talk about referendums, but I'm not going to talk about referendums. So I think my answer will be able to address both of those questions, right, together. So I propose we follow the following structure. We group as many of these together. So we talk about e-petitions and initiatives in our first paragraph encounter. We talk about citizens, juries, and town hall meetings in our first paragraph encounter. And then we have a separate paragraph on recall elections, right? So that's, I suspect, how we can use a number of direct forms of direct democracy. So I would structure it like this in, looking at different forms of direct democracy. Let's go through the different forms of direct democracy first. And then, I would, and as we go along, I will give you the pros and cons of these. Now, I don't know if any of you have looked at initiatives. I know there is a little section in the textbook about initiatives, but I'm not sure if very many students register that it's a form of direct democracy or that we should know about initiatives. So let me go through what initiatives are. Initiatives are a form of direct democracy and involves the forcing of a public vote on an issue through the use of petitions, right? So it may be, so we can say this is a form of referendum, but it's not. It only applies to votes that originate So referendums only apply to votes that come from the government or parliament. Let me say that in a different way. An initiative is a petition you and I sign to gather enough signatories in order to trigger a referendum, a vote on an issue. A referendum normally comes from the top. It comes from a government or from the parliament, and the government and parliament say, we're now going to have a referendum on independence. We're going to have a referendum on Brexit, right? So initiatives are a way of triggering a referendum, right? In the United States, these measures, they may call it a ballot measure, or a proposition. That's what they call it in the United States. They have it in a number of states, and citizens can come together. And if so, for example, 10% of the citizens sign a petition and say, we now want to have a referendum on a particular issue, they can hold that referendum, right? Sometimes initiatives don't trigger referendums. Sometimes they trigger a parliamentary vote. So it's a way of forcing your legislatures to respond to a particular issue, right? But generally speaking, initiatives are there to trigger referendums, right? So it's people triggering referendums. I've said it in so many different ways. Many argue that initiatives are a really good idea because at the moment, we just don't have the ability to make a direct impact on legislation anywhere in the UK. We don't have initiatives in the UK, right? So if, for example, we had initiatives, then maybe some things which the public are concerned with, but maybe politicians are not concerned with, would now be forced on the legislative agenda. So, for example, I'm just thinking of an example. The public may have stronger views on law and order than politicians may have. Politicians have to balance things like prison places and have to balance monetary concerns and have to balance all sorts of issues. But maybe the public, for example, there's this big issue at the moment about how the police are not doing enough to investigate low-level crime. So if my bicycle gets stolen from the station, the police are going to come and take a report, but they probably aren't going to do very much about it because it's just too low level for them to worry about. Even if, I don't know, decide that I'm going to be a master sleuth and I'm going to work out how to, I'm going to sort of, go around and working out sort of the footsteps of the criminals in my local area. And I go to the police with that information. The police aren't necessarily going to pursue it because they've got bigger fish to fry, right? And that's the problem. Now, imagine if we had initiatives. People probably will put that on the agenda and say, well, we want our local police to respond to these low-level criminal issues. We don't want them, burglaries go by without the police ever really seriously investigating these things, right? So initiatives are a way for people to take back control. You've heard that phrase before, for people to have direct impact on the types of concerns that politicians should look at. An example of initiatives use would be in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there are around 4 initiatives every year, successful initiatives every year, where citizens come together. And I think they need, Switzerland's a very small population, so they need around 100,000 signatories. And then they can trigger a referendum of a public vote based on that initiative, right? So, you can see how initiatives as a form of petition would give people more power. It would give people greater control over their issues or over issues that they would like legislatures to take. Now, I hope you're taking notes, by the way, because I'm saying a lot of things that are beyond the PowerPoint. But do you have any questions on just what initiatives are before we look at some of the problems with initiatives? Do you have any questions on initiatives? Oh, did my camera just go off? Can you see me still? I'm sure. I hope you can. Any questions? Everyone good? Right. Okay. So I take it from Chloe, do you mean initiatives in Switzerland? Have any Swiss initiatives been successful? I suspect that's what you mean. Um, no, Lena, it's different to e-petitions, and I'll come to e-petitions. And that's why I put, if you go back to there, I put initiatives with e-petitions because it's similar. It's e-petitions and initiatives are actually very similar things. Jivan, we don't have initiatives in the UK. So in the UK, we have e-petitions, we don't have initiatives, right? Yes, in Switzerland, there have been a number of successful initiatives. One such example was, and hold, believe it or not, in Switzerland, they held an initiative a few years back to ban the minarets of mosques, right? So there was an entire petition that was signed by Swiss society, which went through, and then it went to a referendum to ban a minaret attached to a mosque. Now, a minaret is those tall spires that you may see in Middle Eastern Turkish mosques, right? Where the call for prayer is undertaken. So, you've seen it in pictures, right? That tall spire where the call of prayer is undertaken. Well, in Switzerland, there were no minarets in any of the mosques, and there was never an intention to build a minaret for any mosques in Switzerland. So why would there be an initiative on minarets when there's no intention to do anything like that in Switzerland? Well, the answer is it was a signal they wanted to send to migrants that you're not welcome here, in effect. And it was the right-wing parties that raised the initiative. So the initiative came from, the hard right. And I suppose, and the idea was to say, well, look, those Syrians who may plan to come to Switzerland as part of fleeing from an evil dictator, well, Switzerland isn't a country that you're going to be welcomed into. Do you get the point, right? The Swiss signed the petition. It then led to a referendum, and the referendum was successful. So the majority of Swiss people voted to ban these minarets and mosques, even though it's a non-issue. So what do we take from that example? Well, one thing we can take is that minority rights are not going to be protected when you take away the safeguards politicians call referendums, not the people. Imagine if people call referendums, well, you just have to have heightened tensions, or you just have to have a period where there are, anti-immigrant feelings, for example, and you can get all sorts of laws that are going to be pretty problematic for minorities, right? Think about, if you consider the death penalty, for example, a good number of people in the UK would like there to be a death penalty, for example, especially at a time when there's a horrific crime. Now, maybe, just maybe, politicians are a little wiser and they realize that that's probably not a good idea. And so politicians decide we're not going to do that. Whereas majorities of people may decide that's a good idea, right? So is it a good thing to give people such a direct vote on an issue where their biases and their prejudices, their collective biases and prejudices may impact that decision, right? It's what we call mob rule, the idea that the mob can make a decision that may disadvantage the minority. I hope you get that example. The same as Lena, same as the UK public disagreeing with Parliament to vote on the ban the death penalty. Yeah. I mean, exactly. So as I said, initiatives are not used in the UK, but it's a proposal that initiatives should be used as a greater form of petition. So this paragraph would be about petitions, basically. The initiatives paragraph will be about petitions. Right. I've done this all the wrong way. I'm just going to skip. I'm going to go to e-petitions and then come back to this. All right. Let's then talk about another form of petition that is in the UK. So initiatives aren't used, but e-petitions are. And e-petitions are a form of direct democracy, but they're a pretty weak form of direct democracy. So the UK Parliament petitions website allows members of the public to create and support petitions for consideration by the Parliament, right? By Parliament. So although the UK Parliament's Petition Committee considers all petitions that receive 100,000 signatories or more, there is no automatic parliamentary debate of those that pass this threshold. So if you get 100,000 or more, you just may have that debated, that issue debated in Parliament, but you may not. It may be that Parliament decides it's not going to address your issue. And it doesn't have to give you a specific reason to do so. It may just, say that we felt there was too much business on and we couldn't have a discussion about it. But government will respond to all petitions that get more than 10,000 signatories. So I suppose that's a good thing. The government is forced to give you a response. But as I said, the Petitions Committee in Parliament, which is a special backbenchers committee, has the right to accept or reject that petition. So as of March 2019, the petition with the most signatories was 6.1 million signatories, and it was to revoke Article 50 of the EU. There was another petition to not allow Donald Trump into the UK, right? Both petitions failed, actually, this one here to revoke a request of the revocation of Article 50, so to remain in the EU, Parliament didn't even debate it, and Parliament said, well, the decision's already made by a referendum, we're not going to revisit this issue. But Donald Trump issue, Parliament said we cannot it's not Parliament's decision to invite Donald Trump or not. So Parliament said, well, we can't do anything about it. It's up to the government, and we can't stop the government from inviting Donald Trump to the UK. There was a number of signatories. I've got an example here, but we don't need to go into all of them. So a 2007 petition to oppose plans to introduce road pricing gathered 1.8 million signatories on an earlier version of the petition's website hosted by Downing Street. Prime Minister Tony Blair emailed all those who signed to inform that the trials will still go ahead. So in 2007, there was an e-petition to not introduce road price, congestion charging, and Parliament's and the Prime Minister said Tony Blair said, we're not going to follow through on that petition, right? So the problem is it's a weak form of democracy. It doesn't really give you the ability to make direct decisions, even though we can call it a form of direct democracy. Because remember, Parliament is still the filter here. Parliament makes the ultimate decision. Now, there have been some successful e-petitions, which I haven't mentioned here, but it's worth saying. For example, probably to date, one of the most successful e-petitions was the e-petition for there to be a public inquiry into the Hillsborough disaster. If you remember Hillsborough, that was where Liverpool supporters were crushed in the 1980s at a stadium in Sheffield. And at the time, people blamed the supporters, but there was, all governments said they're not going to hold a public inquiry. So that's the Conservative governments before 97, and even Tony Blair and Gordon Brown refused to hold a public inquiry. It was only Theresa May, after this e-petition was signed, and it gathered a large number of signatories, Parliament debated it, and the feelings in Parliament was so great that Theresa May, as the Home Secretary, decided she has to move and she is going to have a public inquiry on it. And the public inquiry, it basically came to the conclusion that the supporters were never in the wrong, but it was actually the law, it was the police, it was the security at the stadium. These and the media colluded with the police to lie and say that the supporters had stormed the stadium, but it vindicated, in other words, the supporters. And the good people of Liverpool, who've got the best football team in the world, by the way, they were now in a place where they could hold their heads up high after 20 odd years of being accused of causing that disaster. Okay, so e-petitions sometimes do work, but they don't we can say even with that Hillsborough thing, no one has ever actually no one has ever been prosecuted. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There have been some prosecutions, but no one has ever successfully been prosecuted for the Hillsborough disaster. So a couple of police officers after the Hillsborough disaster, after the inquiry, were brought to trial, but the trial did not find them guilty, right? Because it was just the length of time was too great. So you can say, although it did create public opinion and it changed the mind of government, it didn't lead to a successful prosecution. The other problem with e-petitions, it creates, what we call problem, you can say very sort of problematic petitions. There are tons of these. You go on the e-petitions website and you find tons of these where people just have a laugh. And so they, this guy wants his mate to be unbarred from his local pub. This person got 10,000 signatories and he asked for there to stop making so much news happen. So people do not take sometimes these e-petitions particularly seriously. So that's e-petitions, and again we can see the problem with that, right? Let's move on to another form. I'm going to go back to now, what was the order? I can't remember my order now. Yeah, let's talk about citizens, juries, and town hall meetings. Right, so let's talk about citizens' juries first, and then we'll move on to town hall meetings. Citizens' juries are another form of direct democracy. We don't see citizens' juries used in a very big way in the UK. So like in initiatives, we don't see very many citizens' juries. However, they are used, right? So especially on the local level sometimes. And during the Brexit period, there was a conservative MP who was an ex-minister who stood for conservative leadership, a guy called Rory Stewart. And Rory Stewart was calling for a citizens' jury on Brexit because he believed that the government didn't have a mandate to pursue a hard Brexit. He wanted there to be a citizens' jury first before the government made its decision on what type of Brexit it should pursue. So what are citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies? These are like a jury in a court. This is an opportunity for a select number of people who represent the breadth of the country, that represent the wider population, are randomly picked. So, possibly 9 of them or 12 of them are randomly picked. And they meet for a period of time to discuss one issue. And after they deliberate, so after they talk about the issue, after they hear from expert witnesses and debate and discuss the issue, they come to a conclusion collectively, right? And once they come to a conclusion, the assembly is dissolved. So it may go on for weeks. They may invite lots and lots of expert witnesses. And a good thing about these types of assemblies or citizens' juries is that it allows for focused deliberation, where you're talking about a particular issue in a focused way. It allows for open discussion and questioning, which you can't get in say, referendums. In referendums, things are so general and so broad and so wide, you tend not to get to the details of an issue. Whereas a citizens' jury will have people who aren't experts, but they'll invite experts along and they would debate and deliberate and look at issues from every angle. And the idea is for them to come to one particular view, or if they don't come to one view, to come to a view through informed discussion. And then that view, if there's one view, that will go either to Parliament, and the parliamentarians then will take their view and debate and discuss whether they're going to accept it or not, or it could inform a referendum. So in Ireland, as a good example, there was a citizens' jury. So this is the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland. So it's not used in the UK, but in the Republic of Ireland, there was a citizens' jury on abortion laws. If you remember, in Ireland, it's a very strong Catholic country. abortion has effectively been disallowed for a long time. It's been illegal. And there were a number of high-profile cases of women who died because they couldn't get access to an abortion and they had major health concerns. And so a citizens' jury was held. The people deliberated. They had people who were pro-life, people who were pro-choice, people who were in between. And the consensus on the jury was, the majority on the jury was that we do need to change abortion laws because the laws as they stand are just not strong enough and are too strong. They need to be diluted a bit, right? And so even like the Catholics, the strong religious people on the citizens' jury decided that after hearing the expert evidence that there needs to be some give. As a result of that, the informed opinion of the citizens' jury went to the public through a referendum, and the referendum came back and said that we do need to have a change and legalize abortion, right? And so it is said that the citizens' jury really did play into that informed debate. And of course, those members who were on the citizens' jury, they would then go around the country and talk about their experiences and talk about what they had debated. Do you get the idea? I hope you get the idea behind it. Before we talk about the problems with it, do you get the idea behind it? Yeah, Lena, did it illegalize abortion completely or not completely? But you can say that it brought abortion law probably in line with, many countries like Germany, whatever would have, right? So it did bring abortion laws in. I mean, of course, it's not it didn't make it. I don't think it wasn't the most liberal of abortion laws, but neither was it the most sort of closed of abortion laws. It was somewhere in between. Yeah. Okay. So the strengths of citizens' juries is that it creates a direct citizens' input. It's impartial and objective in terms of its decision making. No one is telling them and informing them how to make their decisions, in other words. Yeah, Chloe, why don't we use them more if they work well? Well, we are going to talk about that because there are people who argue, well, isn't it? I mean, I think citizens' juries are probably better than referendums, to be honest. I think referendums create more mess than they do clarity, to be honest. Isn't this similar to a parliamentary committee of farmers? I don't know what you mean, Lena. Is there a parliamentary committee of farmers? Sorry, I don't know what you mean. I may have maybe there is. Okay, so yes, it also allows you to interrogate issues with experts and witnesses. It allows you to extend the deliberation. It's highly focused in its discussion, highly specified outcome delivered through a verdict. So there was a very specific verdict at the end, right? What's the point? The point here is that it's a very good way to engage citizens, right? Now, the counter argument to that is that, some issues can be very specific, and maybe, the citizens' jury would not have decided what type of abortion law you want, right? So that question about, is it a very liberal abortion law? Is it very strict? Is it somewhere in between? But citizens' jury would not have made that level of decision. So you're still leaving that up to politicians probably to do. There is a debate about the question. Sometimes the facilitators of the meetings, the ones who are organizing the meetings, may frame the question in a particular way to get a particular outcome. So, and that's linked to that. There may be a preemptive evaluative framework. In other words, you may teach the people to evaluate things in a way that they come to a particular answer, right? You say to them, there are 5 ways by which you're going to evaluate whether you should, you should allow abortion or not. And so you're sort of pushing people in a particular direction by giving them the evaluative frameworks, the criteria, which is set down from above. It's going to be a costly thing, right? These citizens' juries. Okay, it's not as costly as a referendum, but if you're going to have a lot of citizens' juries, it's going to cost a lot of money. And of course, there is a debate about the small sample size. Is that could you really get 9 people who are going to represent the entire population? You know, that's a tricky thing to balance out. Maybe another thing you could say about citizens' juries is that, like Rory Stewart said, it will resolve the Brexit problem, but no one believed it. And by the time Rory Stewart announced there should be a citizens' jury, and this was what, 2018, people were at each other's throats. Everyone hated each other. You were Remainers or Brexiteers. And I can't believe that getting a group of people together in a room would have then solved the issue and settled the animus, the hatred that existed in the country. I mean, families fell out. You read articles today where people have not spoken to one another, family members, for years because of how they voted on Brexit. So I don't know if a citizens' jury would resolve the Brexit issue, right? I'm not convinced of that. So there may be some issues, in other words, that are so big, you really need politicians, you need representatives to resolve the problem. You can't resolve the problem yourselves. Lena, when I went to Parliament, there were committees with MPs and experts on topics such as the environment to inform. So you mean select committees, Lena? You mean select committees, right? Yeah, it's a sort of format of select committee, but select committees are with politicians. They're not, it's not, select committees may bring expert witnesses, but they're politicians who ultimately, put forward recommendations. Yeah. Okay. So I hope you guys have got what citizens' juries and assemblies are. This is another form of direct democracy. And as I said, Ireland is a really good example of how these are used. Right. Let's then talk about, no, here it is. Okay. Let's talk about town hall meetings. Oh, by the way, I mean, in direct answer to your question, Chloe, why do we not use them more? I suspect because representatives and politicians don't really want to have the public narrow down the types of choices they should be making. And if you remember, our form of representative democracy is what we call a Burkean model of representative democracy. You know, Burke believed that representatives betray you if they make a decision based on your opinion. The whole point of having a representative is that a representative is meant to have the ability, the expertise, and the time to make decisions that you don't have the time to make, right? You may make very partial decisions or may make emotional decisions, whereas these politicians are meant to, at least in theory, meant to make more rounded, well thought through decisions. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at town hall meetings as another example of a direct form of direct democracy. So town hall meetings, also called town halls or town hall forums, they originate from North America. So you see a lot in Canada, in the United States. And it's a way for local and national politicians to meet with their constituents, either to hear from them on topics of interest or to discuss specific upcoming legislation or regulations, right? So here's how it works. Imagine, and you can think about town hall meetings, maybe it works better on a local level. Imagine if your local council decided that, isn't a town hall meeting quite similar to constituency surgeries to an extent? Only so much as it is your local representative coming to see you, but in your surgeries, it's a one-way thing. You ask your local representative to help you out because you've got a problem with your roads or a problem with the bin collections, right? It's not really about your local representative saying, I've got this decision to make. Now I want you to make that decision. That's not what happens at local surgeries. At local surgeries, it's really you trying to get your representative to act on your behalf. So it's not that similar in that sense, right? So what is a town hall meeting? A town hall meeting is like, imagine at a local level, your local council decided that they've only got one pot of money, and should they use that for an extension to the library, or should they use that for free transportation for older people in the community to get to the supermarket, right? So maybe a bus is put on for, a regular bus is put on for older people to get to the supermarket or something. or whatever it may be, right? So imagine if that was a decision. They've only got a certain amount of money. What should we do? Now, what they could do is hold a town hall meeting, ask anyone who wants to come to that meeting. You can debate the issue. Okay, look, here's the money. Where should it go? And then at the end of the meeting, you have a show of hands, and the majority decision is where the money will go, right? So you can imagine that can happen quite well at a local level, where your local council seeks your opinion, and then it follows through on the opinion. But also it can happen on a national level, I suppose, where you got your local MP that says, look, I'm going to be told to go to Parliament to vote on, whether to remove the Human Rights Act or not. I'm going to host a town hall meeting and get an impression from my local constituents whether I should vote one way or the other, right? And so that would inform his or her decision making when it comes to voting. Do you see? I hope that makes sense, right? Now, so as I said, in the US, it's a regular thing for these meetings to be held. In Canada, they hold these town hall meetings. During the 93 election, televised town hall meetings were one of a number of initiatives mainstream media adopted to center ordinary citizens at the heart of coverage. All right, don't worry about that. These efforts, which also include panels of voters to offer comment. Yeah, I think I lifted these two paragraphs from somewhere. Problem is, okay, so here's the, was this election or US or Canada? US, this is talking about US elections, right? So town hall meetings are seen to be a very popular way to gather the public. Now, the problem is it seems to favor the middle class and the elderly who may have more time. And so there's a question about whether it's more legitimate than a representative democracy, right? Now, why does it favor the middle class and the elderly? Well, because you normally will get those people who got time on their hands, who are not time poor, who will turn up to these types of things. And so you can imagine, for example, the elderly, young people may want the library, but the elderly may come in large numbers because, let's face it, they've got plenty of time in their hands, maybe, right? I didn't say that in a very diplomatic way, I'm afraid, but you get my point. Like, they're not going to have work necessarily or other considerations. So they may come in large numbers and then vote to say that we want to, have our regular taxi service paid by the council to the local supermarket. And so that would disadvantage young people who may not have the time or the energy or the education to be able to turn up to these meetings, right? In America, for example, you have these school board meetings where it's a similar thing, where you make decisions about where the budget will go for the next year for schools. And typically what happens is that the working parents, maybe even the ethnic minority, Black and minority parents, they're just too busy because they normally, that demographic is going to be working quite long hours, right? And so what normally happens is that the middle class parents come along and they want their daughter Hermione to have extra hockey lessons, right? Whereas, maybe there may be more pressing things for there to be done, right? So you get my point, that the middle class may dominate these types of arenas. So how legitimate is it? How representative is it? And how much does it help? Whereas politicians would take into account the poorer people, those who are working hard and can't, and would not necessarily pass legislation to harm their interests. Yeah. Does that sound cool to you guys? Does that okay? So again, it may lead to mob rule. It may lead to the majority making a decision to disadvantage the minority. Now, as I said, we don't have town hall meetings in the UK, but it's a form of direct democracy you can talk about in an essay. Let's go back to recalls. Right. I know we've spent a lot of time on this, but in fact, can I ask, is some of this new to you? Like, are you learning some new ideas about direct democracy here? I know, I don't normally spend this much time on content, but I do feel that it's important. Good. Yeah. Brilliant. Good. I'm glad. This is great. Good to hear this. Look, I fear that if you get that question about, apart from referendums, do direct democracy, I fear that you may end up, if you don't know these forms of direct democracy, even as examples, you may end up, not being able to answer that question well. And by the way, it has come up before. I mean, not in the current form, but in the previous pre-linear exams, that's pre-2019, there was a question similar to this. So I do, I would not be surprised if this question came up this year, to be honest, because it as I said, that section hasn't yet been covered. Brilliant. Okay, that's good. Let's then talk about recalls, which are used in the UK. So we do have recall elections in the UK. So, and it was passed by the 2015 Recall of Elections Act, which David Cameron passed in the dying days of the coalition government. And it allows for constituents to be able to recall their member of parliament and call a by-election. So a by-election is where you have an election in between general elections, right? So if you don't like your local MP, theoretically, at least, you can get rid of your local MP by signing a petition and replacing that MP by holding another election in your constituency. Now, unlike other countries, the Recall Elections Act does not actually allow constituents to initiate proceedings. So in an essay, you could say, well, there's a difference between recall, say how it's used in California, in America, where the governor can be recalled through a petition signed by the general public. But in the UK, the public do not have the right to start the petition to recall your local MP. Instead, proceedings are initiated only if an MP is found guilty of wrongdoing that fulfills criteria. So first, the Standards Committee in the Parliament have to decide that the MP has done something which is wrong to the degree that that MP now can be recalled. If the Standards Committee in Parliament says, well, now we can recall the MP, then and only then a petition can be signed. And if 10% of all voters, 1 in 10 of all voters in the constituencies agree to sign that petition within a 2-week frame, then a by-election is triggered. That MP can stand again if they want, but a by-election is triggered as a result of that. Now, to date, there's only been 3 petitions, recall petitions. 2 of these have been successful, and they triggered a by-election. 1 of them was unsuccessful. Okay. Now, what are the criteria that leads to a recall? If you get a custodial sentence of a year or less, believe it or not, until 2015, if you were in prison for a year or less, you could still remain as an MP, right? If you go, obviously, if you're in prison for over a year, you have to step down as an MP. You get sacked as an MP, and that was from 1981. Suspension from the House, or if you're suspended from the House for at least 10 sitting days following a report by the Committee on Standards, right? And or if you get a conviction for misleading expenses claims. So these are the 3 reasons. If you go to prison for under a year, if you get banned from the House of Commons for 10 sitting days, or if you get convicted for signing for a misleading expenses claim. So you say that, I'm using this money to go to hire taxis, and in reality, what you're doing is you're going down to Lahore Kebab House on Commercial Street, and you're eating the best kebabs in London. And trust me, once you eat at Lahore Kebab House, you won't want to go to anywhere else. I mean, it's basically the best place for kebabs, for food in general, for all, for all sort of Southeast Asian food. Lahore Kebab House. I mean, it doesn't look very good, by the way. I mean, you go in there and you'd think, okay, this is not a posh place, right? But the food is to die for. It's just the best food. The other day I went to it and I got, what did I get? I can't remember. You got to try out their the keema paratha, right? So I'm saying that in a really English way, but keema paratha. which is basically like, roti chapatis, but it's got mince in it, like a sandwich. Oh, great. I mean, you eat that. It's just amazing stuff, right? Anyway, so if you filled in Mariam is already going to go for it. Good. That's good to hear. I should say to them that if I drum up some business for them, then they should give me a cut. It's worth going to. I mean, if you're ever in London, if you're not from London, if you're ever in London, go down to nearest station is Aldgate East. And you got to walk around. It's around a 10-minute walk, but it's, the mean streets of Aldgate East, you sort of have to have your wits about you a little bit. But it's well worth going to. All right. Lena, who was that MP that caused controversy due to the ethics committee failing to act? The one who sexually assaulted and groped a young man. Yes, that was a Conservative MP whose name is, oh goodness, see, he was the guy who brought down effectively Pincher. Thank you, Izzy. Chris Pincher. Exactly. I mean, there have been a number of cases of this. Look, let's put it this way. The Standards Committee doesn't really go after very many MPs, right? Do you remember that MP? I mean, here's a negative. Do you remember that MP who, she was an SNP MP. She felt bad during the COVID time. She felt bad. She decided to still go on a train, travels to London from Scotland, gets to London, feels even worse, takes a test, and while the test results are coming back, she goes to Parliament. She gives she talks, she asks a question in Parliament, and then she comes back to her home and then gets a text message to say you've got COVID. So then she decides to get on a train and travel back to Glasgow. A catalogue of errors here, or catalogue of willful neglect, right? Now, that's pretty bad. The police decide they're not going to prosecute her. The Standards Committee, I think they don't. If I remember right, they do suspend her only for a few days. So it's not the 10 days which can trigger so she ends up remaining as the MP. The SNP decided they're going to take away her whip, so she would no longer be an SNP MP. But she said, no, I made a mistake, but I'm still an MP. And she continued until the next election. She remained an MP, right? There are a few MPs like that. There's one other guy who at the moment, who again is embroiled in a bit of a scandal, and I can't remember his name, but he remains an MP. His constituents haven't seen him for months, but he still remains an MP. And so the threshold is pretty high to get rid of these MPs. But the idea is to create accountable government. Now, here are the 3 examples of recalls in the UK. Yeah, Lena, who was the Welsh MP? Yeah, that's a good example. The Welsh MP who watched porn in the House of Commons, right? Again, he didn't resign. It was pretty embarrassing for him, but he didn't resign. The COVID MP was Margaret Ferrier. Thank you, Finley. Yes, it was Margaret Ferrier. Yeah, some of you may remember that the Welsh guy. Was he a Welsh? No, he wasn't a farmer. Was he a farmer? He said that he had. Sorry, he said that he had Googled tractors. So anyway, I don't want to go there. Right. So examples of recalls of in the UK, you've got 2 successful recalls, and Sonia who went to prison for less than a year because of a dodgy speeding fine. She refused to resign, and finally they triggered a by-election and the new Labour candidate won. And then you got Christopher Davies, who filled in false expenses claims, and the Liberal Democrat, he restood. The Conservatives allowed him to stand again, but the Liberal Democrats won that seat, right? And Ian Paisley Jr., arguably, by the way, Ian Paisley was the worst. Ian Paisley Jr. Was taking money from the Sri Lankan government, going on holidays to Sri Lanka. He did not declare that to Parliament, yet he was talking in Parliament on behalf of the Sri Lankan government. Now, that's a real conflict of interest, and you're meant to tell Parliament, even before a debate, but also you're meant to register every time you get money from a foreign government, right? But he didn't do that. Believe it or not, the good people of North Antrim did not recall him. And that's partly because in Northern Ireland, it's very territorial. And he is was the unionist MP from the DUP. And you're not going to mess with the local MP. It's only 9.4%, not the 10% signed the petition against him, right? So we've had two successful recalls today. As I said, the problem with recalls is that the way it's applied in the UK, it doesn't really give enough control to people. Recalls are filtered through parliamentarians, through the committee in Parliament, right? And the reasons, the criteria are pretty limited. It requires the House of Commons to first censure the politician before a recall is triggered. It's not really giving people power back. And I think the analysis is that David Cameron introduced, even though David Cameron promised in 2010, it was part of his manifesto that he was going to introduce recalls. He didn't do anything about it actually until 2015, because that was the year he was going to leave Parliament, and he didn't want people to accuse him, and particularly this guy here, Zach Goldsmith, who there's a clip, I won't show you the clip, but Zach Goldsmith, who was a backbencher at the time, he accused him of betraying, the manifesto promise. And so in 2015, he passed this really watered down Recall Act. It's not, the vast majority of MPs are not recalled, even if they do wrong, because they just don't fit within the criteria. Okay, so we have got some pretty good examples of direct democracy. We've looked at recalls, citizens, juries, and town hall meetings, and we've looked at e-petitions and initiatives. And I suppose in these questions, you've got to argue whether it's better to have these forms of direct democracy or whether it's better to have representatives make decisions on your behalf, as well as whether those forms of direct democracy are pretty bad and they're not going to help representative democracy, right? They're going to make things worse. So, for example, the way recall works at the moment, it probably leads to more disillusionment. People feel that their voices aren't heard. Their MPs remain their MPs even after they've made major errors or done a lot of bad, for example. Yeah. Great. Any questions from any of you so far? Any questions? Has that been helpful? Have you gained something from the discussion there about recall and about citizens' juries and the rest of it? Are you guys good with that? Good. Leela, brilliant. That's good to hear. I'm glad, yeah. I mean, you're going to be laughing, by the way, if this comes up tomorrow, in your final exam. I think you'll be laughing, as they say, because I think you would find it very helpful to use these examples. And I can imagine, by the way, if you use any number of these, even if you use all 5 of these, an examiner would say, okay, this person knows what direct democracy is about, and they would reward you for it. They would reward you handsomely for it. Izzy, you've got your paper 1 mock tomorrow. Good. So it was helpful for that. Excellent. Okay. Let's then talk about, oh, by the way, so how are you? I know some of you said you were going to have mocks. I think most of you probably have had your New Year mocks by now. Have you found that your grades have improved? Are things going, do you feel that, I mean, I'm not just saying because of these sessions, but do you feel you're able to write better essays as a result of trying some of these things out? It'd be great to get your view on that. Right. Yeah, good. Okay, some of you are, I found them very positive. Okay, good. Chloe, this is my first lesson as I keep getting D in my mock. So we'd like to improve. Oh, okay. So This is my first. Chloe, I'm sure I've seen you on here before, though, haven't I? Or maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it's a different Chloe. Sorry. Lena, yep, you got 27 out of 30 for the first time using the FATCA one. Oh, wow. So you got that FATCA question, Lena. Oh, no, that's good. 27 out of 30 is pretty good, Lena. Well, it's very good. Lena, if you have some time, can you send that to me? I mean, I'm sure, well, it's written, isn't it? I don't know if you can not scan it, but, take a picture. It'd be great to have a look at it. Abiona, my analysis is better, but it's the timing that I need to work on. Yeah, the only way really to resolve your timing issue, Abiona, is to actually write timed essays in your own time. I think that's the only real way to resolve timing. The more you write something out, the more you stretch your muscles, your hand muscles, the quicker, less thinking time you have as well. Then I've got the highest mark I've ever received in an essay after the session on a topic you covered. Fantastic. Jivan, you were getting 17 to 19. Now you're getting 23, 24, and 25. My exams were out of 25. Oh, yeah, of course. Yes. Great. Good one, Jivan. Adana, unrelated question. How would you recommend to structure a 30 marker, and will you cover comparative theories? Good question. Right. So firstly, a 30 marker, can I suggest you watch my YouTube video on YouTube? So just type in alevelpolitics.com or type in my name and you will get, and I've got, you can go for it. In fact, it's on my website as well. I've embedded the YouTube video on the front page of my website. So I go through how to answer 30 markers. So yeah, just watch that. I couldn't do justice to it in the next few minutes, but if you watch it, you will be, you'll be happy. So yes, Adana, so back to here. I think you're new to this as well, if I'm not mistaken. So back to this. The reason why I didn't go into, I normally do go into a little bit more deep, but these three are our three sections in the essay. So I normally divide up an essay into three sections: for, against, for, against, for, against, and that's how we normally address it. Okay. Elisa, I haven't got my grades back yet, but my essay structure is more efficient now and my timing is improving. That's been my issue for ages. Great. Oh, good. So someone's taken photos of my slides in your class. That's good to hear, Lena. Okay, excellent. So evaluate the view that pressure groups are less influential than corporations in influencing government policy. Right, so we've got around 15, 20